This conference will now be recorded.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everybody. Good morning to those online. So last week I was, was it last week? Yes, it was. Last Saturday I was travelling down into the Eastern Bay of Plenty with Dad to visit a few rallies we haven't seen for a while, but also to catch up with a couple of very faithful sisters. And we had a breaking the bread service, and Dad gave the word of exhortation on the story of Luke chapter 15, the story of a woman who had a disabling spirit. It says for 18 years. So for 18 years she was hunched over, and I had already been doing a bit of a study on Zacchaeus, and I found it very interesting, this really fascinating connection between the story of Zacchaeus and the story of this woman in Luke chapter 15, which we're going to look at and look at that connection. So I'm not really going to talk too much about the woman in Luke chapter 15. That's an exhortation that maybe Dad could give at some stage. But she is similar to Zacchaeus in the sense that she had to overcome a physical disability in order to see Jesus. She was focused downward and couldn't raise herself up. So she was physically unable to raise herself up and see Jesus. Zacchaeus was a very similar character, wasn't he? Because he was short and he wanted to see Jesus, but he couldn't see Jesus because of all the crowd. And so he had to overcome this physical disability through his faith. They both had to do something. She made her way into the synagogue, which was quite remarkable, this woman, in order to be there in the synagogue. There is also evidence that both Zacchaeus and this woman also had to overcome public prejudice. Without going into it, but maybe we'll talk about it at some stage afterwards, this poor woman probably had the prejudice existing that her disability was a direct relation to a sin that she may have committed 18 years earlier. It was a common belief of the Jews that these misfortunes happen to people because of their transgression, and Jesus seems to allude to that in this chapter. Zacchaeus, of course, was rather a despised character as well, and public opinion towards Zacchaeus was not favourable. So they both had to overcome physical disabilities and public prejudice. So I believe this is going to work. Yes. So the other connection with this woman in Zacchaeus is what Jesus calls this woman. So Jesus calls this woman in Luke chapter 15 a daughter of Abraham. Now that is unique. The only time Jesus ever calls somebody a daughter of Abraham in the New Testament. You won't find that reference again. And in Luke chapter 19, he calls Zacchaeus a son of Abraham. And that's unique as well. Zacchaeus is the only person that's called a son of Abraham by Jesus. So these two people do have an interesting connection to each other. I found it rather ironic that here we were with Auntie Elspeth, and here's Dad with doing after this exhort about the bowed down woman, and here is our dear Auntie Elspeth, which was very much struggling to straighten herself up. But such a lovely sister, and she's actually just gone into hospital, so if we can think about her in our prayers would be great. So what was the connection in this story of Luke 15 and the story of Zacchaeus? And that's what we really want to look at in this subject of a daughter of Abraham and a son of Abraham. So if you come back to a quote much earlier in the Lord's ministry, actually in the time of John the Baptist ministry. Luke chapter 3. We're going to start our story. When John the Baptist was preaching in Luke chapter 3, the religious leaders of the day came down to see John, and in verse 7, he calls them a bunch of snakes. And then he says, verse 8, he says, bear fruit. So he tells them that I want you to bear fruit in keeping with repentance. And don't think for a moment to say that you've got Abraham as your father, because God is able of these stones to raise up children to Abraham. So this started in the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And then he says, and if you don't bring forth fruit, verse 9, the axe is laid at the root of the tree. And every tree that doesn't bring forth fruit, God is going to chop down that tree. So there's our little bit of our connection to the beginning of our story of this idea of the religious leaders of the day saying, oh, we're children of Abraham. And Jesus saying, no, don't think to say you're children of Abraham. Bring forth fruits, because God's able of these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Now, it's interesting, just quickly in Luke chapter 15, with the story of the woman that Jesus calls a daughter of Abraham, in Luke 13, or the woman called the daughter of Abraham, the one with the disabling spirit, the context of that miracle that happens in the synagogue is set in the few verses earlier where Jesus just tells a parable in verse 6 about a man who had a fig tree planted in a vineyard, and he came looking for fruit, and he didn't find any fruit, and the owner of the vineyard says, cut it down. Going back to the story of John the Baptist, if it doesn't bring forth fruit, cut it down. And the vineyard servant, the vine dresser, says, leave it alone. Dig it for a year, give me a year to work on it, and then if it doesn't bring forth fruit, you cut it down. So that was the story of this parable, and it's going back to that story of John the Baptist. So what is this idea of, God is able of these stones to raise up children to Abraham, and this idea of bringing forth fruit? Well, of course, John the Baptist was actually standing in the Jordan, wasn't he? He was standing there baptizing in the Jordan. And this story goes back to an event in Joshua chapter 4 in verse 20. So the story of the Jordan River, where John the Baptist was baptizing, the Jordan River, of course, had a miracle when they entered in the land. It dried up, and what they did was they took 12 stones out of the Jordan and they set them up in a place in Gilgal, and they were to become a witness for all future generations of the miracle of entering into the promised land. These stones were like taken out of the depths of the bottom of the Jordan, raised out, and they were set up as a pillar, as a sign. It's interesting where all this happened. There's the Jordan River running down there. There's Gilgal, right next to Jericho. And Jericho's a fascinating place because it's the oldest city in the world. And it's the city which is the lowest city in the world. There is no city that existed that is lower than Jericho. It sits 825 feet below sea level. So this city is below. In fact, when they say you go down from Jerusalem to Jericho, Jerusalem sits 2,500 feet above sea level. So, you know, Jerusalem's built upon Mount Zion. So literally, you go down, 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 down to Jericho. Now, before Jesus was going to go up to Jerusalem, he deliberately and intentionally went to Jericho. Luke chapter 19. And the bookends of Luke 15 and 19 are very interesting, because in Luke 15, Jesus pronounced this to the people, "You will not see me hence until you say, 'Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord.'" Luke chapter 19 is Jesus' triumphant entrance into Jerusalem, where they say, "Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord." Luke chapter 15, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem and says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem." Luke chapter 19, Jesus does exactly the same thing, weeps over the city of Jerusalem. But before he goes to Jerusalem, he goes to Jericho. And as he comes into Jericho, of course, he sees this man, Zacchaeus, up this sycamore tree, a sycamore fig tree. The sycamore tree produces fig fruit. And up there in that tree is like this beautiful, ripe, plump fig that's just ready for plucking. And Zacchaeus has this great enthusiasm to overcome all his physical disabilities to see Jesus. And Jesus goes into his house and he spends a fellowship meal in his house in Luke chapter 19. And he says, "Salvation is come into this house today." Today, salvation has come into this house. The Son of Man's come to save that which is lost. And he says, "For this is a son of Abraham." Verse 9. Jesus said, "Today salvation has come into this house, for he is a son of Abraham." And then Jesus left Jericho after this and went up to Jerusalem. Now, if you have a look at Hosea chapter 9 just for a minute before we move on from there. Hosea chapter 9 says this about God's relationship with the fathers of Israel, the ancestors of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says in verse 10, "Like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel." So somebody's walking along in a desert, really hungry, and he comes along in a desert and he suddenly finds this grapevine full of grapes. And God says, "That's how I found Israel, like grapes in a desert." So refreshing. And then he says, "And I saw your ancestors. I saw your fathers like the first ripe in a fig tree." I saw your fathers like the first ripe in a fig tree. I was walking along and I looked in the fig tree and it's like, oh, yay, there's a lovely fig there. And that's how God saw Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So no wonder with Zacchaeus sitting up there in the fig tree, Jesus says, "Ah, a son of Abraham, like the first ripe in the fig tree." Then Jesus, of course, goes up into Jerusalem. Wasn't so good in Jerusalem. We suddenly meet angry Jesus. And it's a different story. He goes into his father's house and it's a den of robbers. They're ripping people off. And he overthrows all the money changers and he says, "You've made my father's house a den of robbers." And we discover in Matthew chapter 21 that early in the morning he returned to the city and he was hungry. And he came across a fig tree if he might find some figs on it. And he didn't find any figs in the fig tree going up to Jerusalem. And so he cursed the fig tree, and the fig tree withered up instantly. The tale of two cities, the comparison between Jericho and Jerusalem. Down there in Jericho, the city of the curse was Zacchaeus. As he came up to Jerusalem, which should have been the city of the king, it should have been God's holy city, he went into his father's house and it was a den of robbers. And look at the difference between Zacchaeus and the people. Zacchaeus stood and said, look, half my goods I give to the poor, and if I've wronged any man, I'm going to pay him back fourfold. If I've been unjust in the way I'm dealing with something, I will pay 4 times that amount. That's the statement of Zacchaeus, the fruitfulness of Zacchaeus. Whereas in the house of his father, they were ripping people off 4 times what it was actually worth. It was a den of thieves. And, you know, the story of a naked fig tree kind of reminds you of something else, doesn't it? He went looking for figs. He didn't find any figs. What he found was a naked tree, just covered in leaves. It takes you straight back to the transgression of Adam and Eve. So when you come into Luke chapter 19 again, when Jesus entered into the city and they cried, "Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord," in verse 30, the Pharisees turned to Jesus and says, "Tell them to shut up. Rebuke your disciples." And Jesus said to them in verse 40, "If they are silent, the stones will start crying out." God is able of these stones to raise up children to Abraham. If they are silent, the very stones will start crying out. And then he says, pronounces a judgment upon Jerusalem, and he says of Jerusalem, he says in verse 41, the days will come upon you, your enemies will barricade you round about and hem you in and will tear you even to the ground and your children, and they shall leave not one stone upon another. And he told a parable to them in Matthew chapter 23 at the same time about 2 servants. And he asked them which one did the Father's will, and they said the first. And Jesus says, I'm telling you this, publicans and prostitutes will go into the kingdom of God before you. Publicans and prostitutes. He had just gone to Jericho. The last mention of Jericho in the Bible, the last person saved out of Jericho was a publican. Who was the first person saved out of Jericho? A harlot. Rahab the harlot is the first person that's plucked out of Jericho, a city of a curse. A harlot and a publican, the first and last, the bookends of the story of Jericho. And you know what happened to Jericho? It said the wall fell down flat. And the emphasis in the Hebrew was that there was not one stone left upon another of Jericho, except for the section of wall where Rahab the harlot was. And it says they redeemed out of Jericho the gold, the silver, the vessels, and they brought them into the treasury, into the house of God, and Rahab and her family. She is included in amongst the treasures that are found in Jericho. Interesting, isn't it, that the disciples would say about Jerusalem, oh, look at these beautiful stones. Aren't they incredible? And Jesus says, the days are coming when not one stone shall be left upon another. It's going to fall completely flat. And so the parable that we see in the story of Zacchaeus and of Rahab is the story of these two precious lives which are saved out of destruction, saved out of the city of curse. And that is amazing. You know, this is the place which is the lowest point on the planet. It's the city which is below sea level. It was the city of curse. And yet God can reach down into this depths of this place below sea level, and he can redeem a prostitute. And he can redeem a publican that was despised. And God is able to save the worst of us from the deepest, darkest holes that we might find ourselves in. He's able to raise up children to Abraham. And no wonder that you find with Rahab that, as with Zacchaeus, she's intimately connected with the story of Abraham. In the epistle to James, chapter 2, and speaking about the faith of Abraham, James writes about having faith and works, and he links two people together. He says in verse 23, the scripture was fulfilled that Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. And you see a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And then immediately he says, in the same way was not Rahab the prostitute justified when she received the messengers and sent them out another way. And here's this connection with Rahab and Abraham. God is able of these stones to raise up children to Abraham, and he did so in the means of saving Rahab the harlot, and he did so in the means of saving Zacchaeus. Knowing that we were ransomed from our futile ways that we inherited from our forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver and gold, but by the precious blood of Christ. We have been saved not by silver and gold, but by the precious blood of Christ. You are come to a living stone that is in the sight of God, chosen and precious. Rahab was chosen and precious. Zacchaeus was chosen and precious because they had faith. They wanted to see Jesus, and they did so, overcoming all sorts of discrimination. Imagine Rahab coming into the camp of Israel. Imagine the talk. Imagine the gossip afterwards. They saved who? Rahab. What was her occupation? Really? And she comes into the tribes of Israel as a child of Abraham. Not only that, she comes into through her, of course, is the direct line to Jesus. When you read Matthew chapter 1, she's included in there. Read James chapter 5, she's included there. And there's Zacchaeus, the publican, despised class of people, spoken against by all the people. And yet God chose Zacchaeus. So as we come to bread and wine this morning, brothers and sisters, all of us have been redeemed through the precious blood of Christ. We are chosen. We are special. We are selected. We are precious in his sight. And we've been taken straight out of the city of destruction. We've been taken from our futile ways and brought into this incredible family and become sons of Abraham and daughters of Abraham.